Hello and welcome to the School Leadership Show. Mike is not here today, but I am here and I am Jen David Lang. In addition to co-hosting this podcast, I also summarize education and leadership books as part of a subscription service, as you know, called The Main Idea. And I also run online mastermind groups. And this work is some of the best PD for school and district leaders I've ever been involved with. You can find both at themainidea.net. Through my work with The Main Idea, I scan hundreds of education and leadership books to choose just one a month to summarize for you. And this month, I chose a book about rigor. I have been hearing concerns about the decrease in rigor that leaders had been seeing, and I wanted a book with both a compelling definition of rigor, but also with practical strategies for teachers to be able to up the rigor in their classrooms. And so that's why I chose Michael McDowell's latest book, Rigor Redefined, 10 Teaching Habits for Surface, Deep, and Transfer Learning. And we'll get into this book and all of it that it has to offer. But first, I want to share. I want to introduce you to Michael McDowell. He has been a public school educator for over 18 years. He started off as a middle and high school science and math teacher, much needed, thank you. Then he served as coach and consultant for schools, districts, education, organizations, and more. Finally, he entered administration and was both a high school principal, an associate superintendent, and a superintendent in California, just outside of San Francisco. You can see the Golden Gate Bridge if you are watching this. So that's fantastic. Wonderful. Welcome, Michael, to the show.
Thanks, Jen. It's great to be here.
So glad you're here. Well, let's dig right in because I know rigor is a topic people are very interested in. So this isn't your first book. It's not your first book about rigor either. You have one about transfer learning. That is the skill of taking what students learn in one class and applying it in other situations, including the real world. So how did you become interested in rigor as a topic?
Well, thanks, Jen. That's a great question. For me, it was my first experience in New Zealand. I actually had an opportunity to go to New Zealand and work with some schools that Professor Hattie had brought me, kind of alerted me to and said, hey, you need to check out these schools. And I was blown away by how kids talked about their learning. And in particular, they talked about rigor in such a different way than how we think about it here in the United States, or at least for me, how I thought about it. I thought about it as something that's hard. We're doing a lot of things, so I have a lot of work to do, or it's just a really hard problem. And if you solve that, that's rigor. And what these students were talking about is it's about balance. So it's about knowing things, it's about relating things, and it's about applying things, and that they're all equally important. And I remember one student in particular said, look, rigor isn't a hierarchy, it's a taxonomy. And when you think about it,
It was a student who said that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, a young student that talked to me about this and said, it's not hierarchical. It's kind of presented that way, but it's actually a taxonomy. And when you think about it, it's not called Bloom's hierarchy, right? It's called Bloom's taxonomy. Now, they built that pyramid and we kind of lost our minds. And we're like, oh, you got to learn everything before you can go to application. But they really saw rigor as a learning process, as opposed to it's hard or it's easy, or it's really fast or it's really slow. And when I left that and I went back, and at that time I was a principal, I brought this conversation back to my staff. Because when you look at rubrics, like how we evaluate teachers, how we evaluate work, it's almost always get to transfer, right? Like if you get to transfer, you're the best. Like an A, it's transfer. An A is application. And I think the students in New Zealand would say to me, well, no, it's actually about the highest level would be a balance between them. That it isn't about whether you can apply, but it's whether you can actually relate all of those pieces together. So that's really where the journey took me, really kind of out of the mouth of babes, where I'm listening to this, and I'm actually, that makes a lot more sense. That's actually learning, knowing things, relating things, and applying things are surface, knowing, deep, relate, transfer, apply, and that they're all equally important and that you could start or end at any level. To me, really fundamentally changed the way I thought about teaching and learning.
That's amazing. That's amazing that students had so internalized it, right? They understood it so well that they were the ones explaining it to you, not the leaders, the teachers in the school. Wow.
Yeah.
And New Zealand, what a great opportunity to do that.
It was.
So the kids were the ones who said it was not hierarchical. I mean, were they familiar with Bloom's taxonomy or the revised taxonomy or anything, or like where, that's so impressive to me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, at least there, and again, this was a long time ago. I mean, this is probably it's almost like 10, 15 years ago, when they don't typically use Bloom's as kind of the way they reference learning. They use what's called the solo taxonomy. So this was from some researchers there in New Zealand called Biggs and Collins in the 80s. Said we need to have a language that students can use to talk about rigor. And to me, like surface, like knowing stuff, deep relating stuff, transfer applying stuff, it's really simple. It's really easy to like look in a classroom and say, I can see that. Like they know things, but they're struggling with relating them, or they are applying things, but they may not necessarily know enough to be able to apply it effectively. And I think that this language was just so easy to transfer and to apply into classrooms that I think that's why that particular type of taxonomy became so predominant, at least in the schools that I was in and in schools that I've worked with in Australia. And then now, a lot of the schools that I work in, it's just easy for students to talk that way and to say, oh, here's where I am in my learning. And I think that metacognitive piece is just so powerful with this idea of rigor. And here's the thing, Jen, and this I think is really important. Like when I was writing this book, there was a survey that came out, and they basically asked educators like, what are the top 10 words you like hate? Like anytime anyone references, like I think it was like an ed week, and they were like, what's the word, like differentiation or tier one or what, or MTSS, right? And I think rigor was number one, right? I think people were like, we hate this word.
Yes.
We don't really know what it means. Like it's like a 4-letter word for us.
Right.
And I think part of it,
That was a book.
what's that?
That was a book that I summarized. Rigor is not a 4-letter word.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a part of that is we have to make it a little bit more concrete, and we have to be able to provide really tangible examples of it. So for me, rigor is a balance between surface, deep, and transfer. And you can start or end at any particular type of learning. Like you could start at transfer or you could start at surface. And I think the more we privilege one over the other, we always are in pendulum thinking. We're always in that dichotomy between, well, are they innovating? Are we going back to basics? And we see this in so many different ways in terms of policy and decisions that we make. And we really have to be thinking, is there balance?
So yeah, I like that. So let's take so your definition is that rigor is a combination of surface, deep, and transfer learning. And then because of that definition, can we talk a little bit about what rigor is not and what how that contrasts with how many of us might have thought about rigor, or some of us may still think about
Sure.
rigor in the classroom. So how is this different from how historically or traditionally educators have thought about rigor?
Sure. I mean, I think one particular myth of rigor is the amount of work that students do,
Mm.
right? And there was a study that was done here in California, and they found that 70% of students complete tasks, but only 17% of those tasks are at standard, right?
Mm.
So kids are really busy. And I've seen a lot of students, including my own children, where they've done a ton of work
Yeah.
and they have to do it on really tight deadlines. And we think, well, because of the pacing, that's rigorous. And I would say, well, it depends, because if you're doing all of that work really, really fast, but it's all low level, does it really matter?
Right.
You could also do the flip side. I think I hear a lot about innovation, right? Like we're going to do building thinking classrooms. So instead of horizontal boards, we're going to do vertical boards, and everyone's going to go and work in groups. And we think that rigor might be kids doing projects. But I've been in a lot of spaces where students are presenting on a project and they don't know anything. Like it's hollow. They're like, oh, well, we should get rid of all of the greenhouse gases in the air. And I'm like, well, tell me a little bit about greenhouse gases. And they're like, next question. Right. So like sometimes and this to me is a big myth of rigor, is that we don't think of it as balance. We think of it as privileging. So to me, it's about, we privilege a certain type of learning, level of learning. And I think the second is this idea of we just do a lot of work really, really quickly. And I think when we kind of combine those two things, I think that we get into trouble. And I think that's not what rigor is. And the research would show that 90% of instruction is usually at surface. So it's knowing stuff and knowing a lot of it quickly. And the challenge with that is that's typically below standard. And that's not helping students actually get to that deep to transfer. And when you go to inquiry-based schools, we see a lot of transfer and we don't see a lot of surface and deep. And so you have these hollow problems and projects.
Wow. So you said 90% of instruction is surface currently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very high. That is not a balance of the three, surface, deep, and transfer. So it's interesting, you talk about privilege, and the other area that I am concerned about historically for rigor is that we have reserved it for the AP classes, right? Or the students who are attending, gifted and talented schools or classes, or honors level classes. And I think that idea of hierarchy, that you don't have the privilege, or you don't get to deep or transfer until you've mastered the surface, is something that's also a part of your definition. So can you talk about this, like rigor is for everyone, that's implicit in your definition?
Sure. I mean, I think the first part, I think AP classes do a pretty good job across rigor, and part of that is because they establish really clear exemplars of what we expect of students to be able to know things, relate things, and apply things. And I think what often happens in many classrooms is that because students don't have a strong level of background knowledge, what we think is, well, we got to build all that background knowledge before we can even have access to anything else. But I've never found a school anywhere in the world where you can intervene your way into instruction. Where it's like, well, if we just keep intervening, if we just keep teaching surface, we're going to get to deep and transfer. And the thing is that we should really be defaulting to deep in almost every single classroom. We should be thinking about, how do I get students to relate ideas, not just know them? So when I think of those three, I think about, if you have a teeter-totter and one side is surface and one side is transfer, our default position should be in the middle at deep. So when they need to know something new, I pull it in. And when we need to go and try to apply it, we go to transfer. And what I find a lot of schools saying is, well, if it's a hierarchy, you got to start at surface. But I would say, but if it's a taxonomy, let's look at where is that place where the standard sits, where we have balance. And then when we want to apply, we go here. When we need to know new things, we need to do this. And so I think in a lot of classrooms, we're like, well, they don't know enough. I mean, I've never taught a math class where everyone was ready. They're like, I did K8 and I got it all. Like, I had kids struggling with ratios and proportions and graphing and all of those things. But that did not give me permission to say, well, we got to do all the surface stuff for the next 9 months and we'll see if we pick it up. It doesn't work that way. So part of it is to say, yes, they have some missing pieces. What we're going to do is we're going to try to put those pieces together by defaulting to that level of deep learning and then moving to surface and moving to transfer. And there's small doable practices that teachers can do, because sometimes you hear deep learning, you think like deep space, like I've got to do a jigsaw, Socratic seminar. Well, that's an event. That's not a routine. They need to be small practices where students might do a turn and talk, and they need to work on using conjunctions or subordinating conjunctions or appositives or fronted adverbials as like ways in which, so if they're learning about living things and non-living things, the teacher's like, great, I want you to put living and non-living things, and then I want you to create 3 sentences with because, but, so. So living and non-living things are both part of an ecosystem because, but, so, and I want you to use that. So they're taking some of that surface, but they're combining it with deep, and they're doing it within a practice teachers already know how to do. And they're like, oh, that's all that is? Yeah, that's all that is. But the key is you got to do it every day. So a big part of it is balance, but then it's working with teachers to say, but these practices aren't big practices, but they have to be done all the time. John Hattie found out of 17,000 classrooms that he observed, he did not find one example in which kids had an experience at transfer. And I think that is because we think of it as an event. Oh, we'll do a project once testing is over. See, in advanced placement classes, it's like it's defaulted to deep. And then you have to apply it by looking at these exemplars. And we're going to do that all year round. We should just be taking some of that same kind of model and that ethos and say, let's bring that down to kindergarten, because that's what the standard is saying. And I think those are the keys to say, look, that's access for all. You can do a conjunction with every single kid on earth, right?
So John Hattie in 17,000 classrooms didn't find a single example of transfer. I hope I didn't jump too much into your definition, and maybe it would help for listeners. Do you mind just sharing a simple definition of, what is surface, what is deep, and what is transfer learning? Because I think sometimes, we just don't fully know what transfer learning is or learn about it in school. So, what are these three?
So surface would be knowing things. So let's just go back to the living and non-living things. So like students are like, I know what a living thing is, plant. I know what a non-living thing is, rock or virus, right? Like I know what they are. Like you could quiz me on them and I could be like, that's what it is. Now, if as a teacher, I might say something like, can you relate them?
Mhm.
Deep would be, okay, living things are related to non-living things because they're both part of an ecosystem.
Mhm.
So that would be deep.
Mhm.
Transfer would be, can I now apply that into the real world? So, for example, if we introduce a new species, does that affect the ecosystem? So let's look at wolves. What
Mhm.
about the zebra mussel in the harbor there in New York City, right? An invasive species. What about a wildfire? Would that affect the ecosystem in both living and non-living things? So when we get to transfer isn't knowing more stuff. It's not depth, right?
Mhm.
Surface is like narrowing in and being like, do I know stuff? Deep is like, can I relate it? And then transfer is like having a little hinge and saying, okay, where does that apply? Like it applies here and then here and then here. So if you remember those like old highlight magazines where it's like spot the difference between the two pictures,
Yeah.
that's all transfer is. It's like, oh, so you're telling me that when I look at wildfires or if I reintroduce a species or there's an invasive species, we're still looking at like living and non-living things and kind of like how they interact with each other. It's like,
Mhm.
absolutely. That
Mhm.
is all transfer is. The key is that lots of times we think transfer is like a project. It's like a big event. And it's
Yeah.
like, it's not events. This is a habit. It's
Right.
just a habit. But that would be surface deep transfer.
Yeah, and people often say transfer, like that's the goal of school. It's not to teach students to be students, right? It's to teach students so that they can go out and transfer and apply what they've learned in their personal, professional lives, or future education, or whatever else they're doing, right? It's not just, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I would say I think that's right. I think that just to put some nuance to that, but it's not just transfer, right? Like the goal, and you said it at the second in the second part of what you said, which I think is the most, which is really really important. It's transferring what I know,
Yeah.
not transfer for transfer sake, right?
Mm.
There's in research we call it impoverished deep learning, and it's this idea that so I see that if you look at the research on like problem and project based learning.
Mhm.
Problem project based learning has a range of effect sizes where it could be less than 1 year's growth. I mean, very modest effect sizes. In fact, in some studies, they've shown a negative, like a regression for kids to like a year and a half of academic growth. Right. The difference, the variance in that is how much background knowledge you have.
Yes.
So if we design classrooms where it's all student centered and it's all kids working in groups and developing problems, but we're not providing very specific, like explicit direct instruction, using targeted practices at deep learning, what happens is that what kids transfer is more about products and
Mm.
processes and not actually taking my background knowledge of what I know
Yeah.
and applying that in. And that is why it is so important to have a balance. When I hear things like, well, this has to be student centered or teacher centered, I'm like, we're missing it. It's
Mm.
learning centered. It's
Mm.
learning centered. There are times as we get closer to transfer
Yeah.
where by the nature of that kind of learning, it is a little bit more centered on students.
Yes.
And then when we're in surface, it's more centered on teachers. But we always have to think about, are we finding that balance? So it's not just on teachers and kids are watching them work. And it's not just on kids and teachers like, I hope this works out.
Well, and I don't want to blow this up by bringing up a totally different topic, but
Let's
um,
do
but
it.
I'm reading fabulous book Ethan Mollick's Co-Intelligence about AI, and
Yep.
where most people are thinking, oh, because of AI, we don't need to teach kids, facts and knowledge and surface level learning. But in fact, what he argues is that they need it even more because we don't know what AI spits out if it's accurate. We need more expertise to be able to determine the veracity of what AI spits out. And in many ways, AI is better at some of the compare, contrast, the sort of deeper learning, but we do need to make sure that we have the surface learning. It's not something just to throw up and say, oh, no, we don't need that anymore. We don't need surface learning.
I think that's always been a truism of education that facts precede skill.
Yeah.
So if you don't have background knowledge, it doesn't really, like, you're not going to be able to transfer anything.
Yep.
So if you and I read the sports page about the Knicks winning last night,
I,
it
I
would make
watched that live in New York City in a bar with a whole bunch of people. It was so much fun. So I
there,
guess,
there you go. But if you and I traveled over to Australia and we read the sports page about cricket,
oh
we
my
we
God.
would we would struggle with transfer, and that isn't because of our skill; it's because of our knowledge. So yes, I think a medium like AI, to me, AI has a pretty significant bias
Yeah.
Like you can ask certain questions and there are biases that often it's incorrect. And I would actually say you need to have enough background knowledge so that when an AI is spitting out a compare and contrast, whether that's in content, which would be deep, or across contexts, which would be transfer, you
Yeah.
have to have the ability to have enough knowledge and skill to be able to interpret, like, is that what you think it should be?
Yeah.
Is that accurate? What's your prompt engineering? And so, yes, I mean, I agree with Ethan. I think that I think his work is right. That look, knowledge and skill doesn't go away here, and I think we have to make sure we're doing an effective job in teaching declarative knowledge, the background knowledge that you need in schools.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, so for leaders who are listening, there are a lot of charts in the book where Michael compares, for a certain topic, what would surface, deep, and transfer learning look like. And so we gave some science examples, but for some of our humanities listeners, another one from his book, for surface learning, it might be having students identify leaders in the US. And then for deep learning, compare and contrast US leaders based on certain attributes of heroism. And then transfer learning, draw conclusions about whether these US leaders will remain heroes in the eyes of Americans over time. And so I found these charts to be very helpful in comparing the three. So in addition, in the book to very clearly explaining this newer or more nuanced definition of rigor, part of what I appreciate is that your book is very practical. You don't just talk about theories of rigor, but you share actual routines that teachers can implement in their classes to increase rigor. That is this balance. And it makes me think of Ron Richart's book, Making Thinking Visible, in his work, where he talks about thinking routines. And that if teachers can get used to these routines, they will be, almost automatically including more rigor. And if anyone wants to email me, I have a summary of Making Thinking Visible too. I'm happy to send that to you. So can you tell us about where you got this idea of using routines? What are they? What do you mean by routine, and why teachers should use them?
Two quick things. I think the English example that you shared, what's really interesting about that, or social studies example, probably humanities, is that you could start or end that unit at any of those three levels, right? And so you could start at, is this leader going to be a hero in the future, right? Yeah. Is Joe Biden going to be a hero? Is Trump going to be a hero? Is Obama going to be a hero? Like, and what do you think in 15 to 20 years? And they might be like, well, what is a great leader? Like, how would we qualify that? Great, let's go to surface and let's go do that. Or let's compare and contrast these two. So I think what's really important is that while we talked about balance, the fluidity of that is important. The two things about your question about routines. One is I am a big believer in what James Clear says, that we never rise to our goals, we fall to our systems. So to me, it's like, what are your habits? And what are you doing day in, day out across surface, deep, and transfer to be able to support students in doing that particular work? The second piece of research is that Hattie and Donahue in 2016, they looked at surface, deep, and transfer, and they said, hey, there are certain routines that work really well at surface, but not at deep and not at transfer. And so while there are some universal practices that help students with like dispositions of learning, like Ron Rickard's work, like helping kids think how to think, that's universal. Like my relationship with a student, it doesn't matter their level of complexity. They need to know I care about them, I see them, I hear them, right? It does not matter the level of learning. But when it comes to surface, deep, and transfer, there are certain routines that work better at certain levels, right? So explicit direct instruction works really well at surface, not at transfer. Mm-hmm. Whereas inquiry-based, like problem and project-based learning, works really well at transfer. And then like some of the things in the book, like SSDD, which is like similar surface, different depth problems, or an augmented Frere model, or backward fading, lots of different routines are in there. So to me, it's like, is it small and doable you could do every day? That's kind of that going down to systems. And number two, have we selected routines that we feel really comfortable with at surface, deep, and transfer? So like when I work with educators and like leaders, we basically just kind of do an appraisal. Like, where do we feel like we've got this? Where it's like, oh, we're crushing it at surface, or we really have transfer. And what I often find, and this is the most interesting, is we always come to the place where it's like, I don't know if we really have deep learning down. Mm-hmm. And what's so interesting is that's where the standards sit. So you could literally be teaching to a standard and then jump over it and teach over a standard and not actually teach through the standard. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is kids kind of get the gist, they can see some application, but as soon as we say why, compare, contrast. And so a lot of the book, like the biggest chapter in the whole book, is just practices on deep learning. Like there's stuff in all of them, but it's, hey, you could do this 2-box induction, which is kind of like the connections game in the New York Times. It's like, you could do this because, but, so, how, what's the pattern? What are you noticing? And so that was really the impetus. Small and doable. And then this idea of here are practices that work really, really well within that particular area, because you got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. And I think that's the idea.
Yeah, you have in your book, I didn't count how many, dozens and dozens of routines. You have a specific section on surface and the routines that go with surface learning, routines that go with deep learning. You mentioned a few quickly, and I don't know how familiar, some of the ones that you have in the book, many of us know, or maybe I think people know, and then some of them they may not know so well. So could you pick one or two and just really go through the steps, assuming people are listening and can understand just so what might a certain routine look like and what type of learning would it support?
Sure. Let's look at deep learning. We'll look at that, and then we'll look at a transfer example, because I think surface is a little bit more intuitive. So just imagine we're in so there was a study that was done, and they looked at classroom discussion. So classroom discussion is linked to deep learning. Like it is essential for students to talk in order to learn at deep learning. But the question would be, but what do they need to say? Because what the research says is that the quality of student conversation is very, very low. In fact, the highest they've seen is that students in all of the research, the best students speak for about 2 minutes per day at deep. So to me, it's okay, that's probably just routine. So we just need to establish a routine. So what would that routine be? And in the book, one of the first practices I talk them through is what's called a 3-interval turn and talk. So what we do is we say, okay, teachers, like kindergarten teachers, talks to the students and said, okay, we just looked at cubes and squares, turn to each other and form a sentence. And the students say, and so one student says to the other, okay, cubes and squares are both shapes. And the other student says, squares and cubes are both shapes. And then the teacher says, that's great. Now we're going to do it again, and we're going to add in some academic language. We're going to add in the word dimensions. So have a chat. The kid's like, okay, cubes and squares are both shapes with dimensions. And the other student says, okay, squares and cubes are shapes with dimensions. And then the teacher said, okay, now this side of the room, you're going to add the word because. This side of the room, you're going to add the word but. And this side of the room, you're going to add the word so. So the students say, cubes are like squares because if I look at one face of a cube, I have a square. Cubes are like squares, but cubes are 3-dimensional and squares are 2-dimensional. And then this side of the room, cubes are like squares. So if I have 6 squares, I can make a cube. And she says, you know what? Let's just do one more. Let's use a subordinated conjunction. We're going to use although. Okay, although cubes are like squares, cubes are 3-dimensional, squares are 2-dimensional. And that would be it. And what happens is that the students just do this over and 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 over. Like we're like learning how to play the guitar or learning how to swim. Like we just have these reps. So every time we're looking at two things, we just relate them. And the students start to build a habit of deep learning in small, digestible ways. And that is literally taking what they already do, which is a turn and talk on the carpet, and we just add in and infuse that particular piece. That would be one example.
I'm going to pause you. Yeah. Well, first of all, I have in my notes, if you had too many routines in your head to share about the 3-interval turn and talk, which is kind of amazing if people saw how many routines you have. So it's kind of funny. And the cubes and squares, but maybe because we're both former math teachers. But I think it's so helpful because as teachers, there's a lot to plan for. So rather than starting from scratch all the time, you have these structures or routines to be able to do over and over. And not to put another, buzzword topic, cell phones. I think students are speaking less in their non-school lives, right? We see students, kids sitting next to each other with cell phones. And so that research is painful to hear that, the best or the highest amount of speaking time that we're seeing students do in classes is 2 minutes, that research.
Totally.
So, you really emphasize how much speaking, and writing are connected to that deeper learning. And that sometimes, as you've mentioned, teachers think, oh, I'm going to do deep learning. We're going to do, a diorama or a poster, and, but they don't really know the content when you ask them. And so I think it's a great routine. And you notice it's the turn and talk we all know. But for those of us, I've used turn and talk in my time. And what do kids do, right? 4 words and,
Yeah.
And so I think to bring it to those higher levels by requiring more each time is a great way to develop more discussion and deeper learning. So that's a great example of the 3 interval talk. Yeah, go ahead.
And I would just say,
Again, I think two quick things. And one is that you're just bringing these practices into what you already do, right? So to me, it's not like, oh, I have to like change my class. I've got to like remove desks. They have to create a new task. I got to change my unit. I don't think so. I think this is like, look, this is probably a structure you already use. You have kids talk to each other. Here's what we look for. And the second is just because you had this example. So I was in a school last week on Staten Island, and they have those cell phone caddies, so the kids come in and they like place their phones.
Yeah,
and what
like
the teacher did is, yeah. And what the teacher did is this is in a high school class, they laminated index cards with a vocabulary word. So the kids come in, they put their phone in, and then they pick up the index card. They go and they sit down next to their friend. And so as the teacher's taking roll, the students have to form a complex sentence with whatever vocabulary word they got that day. So every day it might be a little bit of a mix. But what I love about that idea is that is teachers stacking a routine into what they already do. Mm-hmm. So that they're not like, rigor, do I have to change my rubrics? It's like, no. Let's not do more design work. Let's do more action work in what you're already doing. And to me, when we do that, it actually sticks. We actually have done some research. So with a school district I work with, they did this work in September. We looked at some routines. We came back in February, and we had 88% of high school teachers still doing those routines. Wow. And that is massive. And I think the reason is people are like, that's small and doable, and I can see where it sticks with what I already do. Other than that, I just don't think change works. I think if you're like, this is a great idea, people are like, that's great. And they may try it once, but one time doesn't work. If you do conjunction Thursdays, it's awful. Kids are like, we hate Thursdays. Like, I'm not coming to school, right? But if you do it every day, it's just like, this is what we do.
And it makes the planning easier. I mean, another reason it sticks is totally. It makes the planning easier. If, we regularly do this laminated card thing. I'm having this image in my mind. I love the image that it evokes of kids putting their, your phone is your computer, like putting a computer into the shoe rack, right? And taking out an index card. I love that. But the ease of it, and that it's not ease for this, it's also easy to give a lecture, the same lecture every year, on September 14th. But instead, you're replacing that with ease of a routine that builds deeper transfer, all different types of learning. Did you want to describe one more routine, or?
Yeah, let's do one.
So I saw this one actually at the same school last week, and I just thought it was brilliant. And I'm going to explain like where they evolved this, but we call it spot the difference. So going back to that highlight, like kind of like those highlight magazines where you're looking at 2 different images, but they both look pretty similar. So what the math teachers have done is, so students will come into class and they'll put 2 math word problems next to each other, and they'll say, don't solve the problems. Just tell us what is similar and what is different between these 2 problems. And basically all the students are trying to do is detect the contextual difference. So they might say, okay, well, this problem is about 2 trains coming at one another. These 2 are about like 2 boats coming at one another. I think these are both just rate problems. They have obviously different numbers and maybe different, maybe this one's kilometers per hour, maybe this one's miles per hour, but they're both just rate problems. That is a transfer. Like that is transfer. We could do that at the beginning of a class. We could do that at the end of class. So this math teacher was helping the students prepare for their Regents exam. And she wanted to make sure that when students saw word problems, that they would be able to transfer and say, when you see this kind of word problem, you'd be like, that's what we're doing. So we're in a pre-calculus class. And she had the brilliant idea of saying, I'm going to actually have students do this. So students created spot the difference problems, put them up, and actually the whole class was trying to do spot the difference. And the student was facilitating this, saying, okay, well, you could probably tell us a little bit more. And then they went and they're having this chat, and they were coming back, and then they explained like what they got right, what they got wrong. And the whole class was engaged. Like I literally just walked into this class. I mean, we're almost at the end of the year. This is test prep, right? It's not the most exciting part of the year. And the kids were in. And this was transfer. And it took 5 minutes, right? It didn't take forever. And the kids liked it. Like they were kind of into it. Like, can we detect? Because it's a puzzle. Yeah. And that to me is a great example of transfer that is so doable that anyone could do it. That if Professor Hattie went and did his research at this high school, they would be like, I see transfer all the time.
Yep.
And he'd be like, and I just saw it on a Wednesday in third period, right? Because we don't say surface for 3 weeks and then we'll do transfer at the end is like your dessert. Like that is hierarchical. And that also creates a real inequity because if it's like, well, these kids don't know things, then only certain kids get transfer. Only certain kids get deep. And to me, it's like, you're missing the point.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, any leader listening to this could share the spot the difference routine with their teacher who could implement it the next day.
Totally.
Yeah, and it reminds me, so I like that idea that it's in our units, we don't have to start with surface and then move to deep and then go to transfer, but also just the sequence within a lesson. It reminds me of, the work that I've seen in looking at math classes in Japan, where,
Yep.
in the US, we always start with, here are the procedures, this is the term, this is a numerator, a denominator, then these are the steps, and now here's the problem. But in Japan, they often begin with a problem. Here are two cell phone plans. This one is, you start out with this base, and then this is how many per minute. And which do you think would be better? And the kids work for solid, 30, 40 minutes.
Sure.
And then from that, you tease out, oh, here's how you can solve this with simultaneous equations, or this is, or going through
Right.
it. Start with the problem. You start with the transfer or the deep. So I think the sequence within a lesson. So I'm going to use that to segue the last question. I appreciate your time.
Sure. Yeah.
Because leaders are the ones listening to this. So let's say I am a leader, I've read your book, or I've read Jen's summary. Oh, and also this month I have a PowerPoint, a slide deck that I'm including with the summary of Michael's book so that you can introduce some of these routines to your teachers. But so I'm a leader, I've read your book. Where can I observe, and we've hit on this, where can I observe for rigor when it comes to teaching and learning? Where or how do I observe for rigor?
Well, in terms of observation of rigor, I think it's starting with what you're seeing from students' actions before you look at what teachers are doing. Because to me, it's like, are the teachers doing a turn and talk? Doesn't really matter. Really, what we're doing is we're trying to figure out what are students saying? What are they reading, writing, and talking about? Are they writing and are they writing facts? Are they relating facts? Are they applying facts? Right. So really what I'm doing is I'm listening for and looking for what students are doing in terms of that surface and that deep and that transfer. And I'm writing that information down and then I'm giving that back to the teacher as an observation, not as a judgment. Hey, here's what I saw. I talked to 10 kids. This is what they said to me. Or I observed this in terms of their reading, writing, and talking. To me, that's a really clear way of doing observations. Graham Nuttall. So like all of that visible learning work from John Hattie, that all comes from the prequel is Graham Nuttall's Hidden Lives of Learners, where he basically found look, you can't see the classroom. He put little lapel mics on, students' lapels, and he just listened to them talk for years. And he found, hey, the classroom's hidden. Most of the things that kids are saying to each other, you can't see it. And the feedback they give each other mostly is incorrect. So if you're going to come in to observe kids. What are they saying? Are they clear on what we're learning? Are they, right? I go in a lot and I'm like, hey, what are you learning? They're like, To Kill a Mockingbird. I'm like, is that what you're learning? And then someone next to me like, no, remember it's like theme. We're learning about like repeated theme, or we're learning about identity or belonging or whatever, forgiveness. And it's like, oh, okay. Well, that student really knows what they're learning. So to me, going in and looking at the complexity of what students are reading, writing, and talking about, like their production, not what is anticipated, not what the teacher is saying, not what's up on the wall, the number of classrooms I go into, and teachers are super clear. And I ask the kids, I'm like, hey, is the teacher clear? And like, super clear. What are we learning? They're like, I don't know. Because it's not a question of whether you're doing great things as a teacher. It's a question of whether kids are with you. So to me, what I'm looking for as a leader is, are they practicing harder than the game? Because in Japan, and the Tim study showed this, that the difference is not that American teachers don't give students some of that deep to transfer, is that they stop doing it as soon as students struggle. And part of that is because if you haven't built that deep and transfer level habits for kids, and then you put them in a situation, like if you haven't done those turn and talks, and then you put kids in a Socratic seminar, you're saying, hey, have a living, breathing essay with your friends, but I haven't taught you how to do the complex sentence work. It's like, it's going to fall flat, except for 2 kids who are going to crush it. And you're like, this was great. I don't know why no one else participated. So as a leader, that's where I would start.
That's great. I love that. I like that focus on student learning. And if as a leader, you want to look for those three levels of learning, the surface, deep, and transfer. Where do you recommend that leaders, look for this in working with teachers?
Well, I mean, I think any lesson, right? Like, I think you can always do it in their design work, right? Like looking at rubrics and lesson plans and units. But I think to me, where you really hit home
Yeah.
is in classroom observations. And when we look at data and we look at how PLCs or how groups are coming up with what action am I going to go take based on this data. I'm a big fan of like short PLC meetings where you look at a little bit of data around observations of students, and then what's that small doable action you're going to go take back in the classroom. But to me, it's like get in the classroom, observe kids, and just write down objectively what you see. Like kids were labeling and listing these particular words. Okay, then you go back in tomorrow and they do it again. So it's like surface day, surface day, surface day. That's when I'd have a conversation with a teacher to say, if we know rigor is balance, where is the deep and transfer even in those days? Like I get that they don't even know what those terms are, but if they don't have a sense to connect those terms or relate those terms, we don't really have the learning process going on. We really just have one particular part of it.
Well, if you have trained them on those terms, what a great exercise as the observer to go in and write down the activities and then to ask teachers, what percentage of what you were doing from my notes and your memory was surface, what percent was deep, what percent was transfer, to get them to name it themselves. That's great.
Yeah, and then see what the gap is, right? And then we can talk about, okay, what's that small doable next step? And I think that's the key, is that we need to just look at like small actions. Like what's 1% better tomorrow?
Yeah, anyway. That's great. Well, thank you. Thank you for your time, Michael. How can people find out more about you, your work? I know you were just telling me before we got on about some workshops that you provide for schools, districts. Tell us what you do. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Jen.
So I have a website. It's hingeeducation.org, and we provide professional learning, and it's all customizable to context. And we do it really kind of in three buckets. So bucket one is associated with school and system leadership on how to make sure that we can sustain rigorous learning. So it's leading for rigorous learning, and we have a pathway and books and support on that, and lots of schools that engage in this work around the world. We have one on teaching for rigorous learning. So basically, Jen, a lot of what we talked about today within the lens of leadership, and that's really on those routines. Like, how do you teach at surface? How do you teach it deep? How do you teach it transfer? How do you embed that just in your lessons right now? And how do you make it concrete, small, and doable? And that includes some professional learning on site, and it can be virtual coaching, and then the final one is my work around inquiry. So I do a lot of work around rigorous PBL by design. And that work is basically taking surface, deep, and transfer. And how do you start and end units at transfer? So basically just changing the sequence and making sure we teach where we start kids with a rich problem, but then we teach through surface and deep and then come back in a transfer in a unit to really help students with that balance. So that's the work that we do, that I do. And I'd love to talk to anyone who's interested in learning more. So thanks, Jen.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. You're so generous with your time. Again, everyone, this was Michael McDowell, Rigor Redefined, 10 Teaching Habits for Surface, Deep, and Transfer Learning. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen.